Richmond injecting room will continue to operate for another 3 years in the face of strong opposition from residents there. Let's bring in David Horseman from the Richmond Residents Action Committee. David, thank you for your time this afternoon. Firstly, what's your reaction to the location of the second injecting room near the Queen Vic Market?
Yeah, well, if there's anything that has been learnt over the 2 years trial in Richmond, it's that location is absolutely critical. So while I can't speak in any great detail to the appropriateness of that location, it's really clear that the Andrews government is going to have a lot of engagement and a lot of explaining to do to anyone that's nearby that proposed site.
And when you talk about those nearby and from your own experience, what impact will it have on the market?
Well, if the Richmond experience is to show anything, it certainly poses potentially a significant risk to traders and to anyone visiting the market. Certainly, there's been a considerable honeypot of drug dealing and injecting concentrated around the Richmond site. And while there may be the argument that that will help spread that load, I think what's quite obvious is you will get a similar circumstance there.
And did you get any advance warning the Richmond trial was being extended?
No, not really. We were contacted by the Minister's office earlier today, just prior to the press conference, but effectively we found out at the same time as everyone else.
And what does that decision to extend the trial mean for people there?
Look, the way I've explained it so far today is it really is a bit of a kick in the teeth to this existing community. We've really tried to collaborate with the government and, as you know, we've done a whole lot of work to demonstrate the impact that it's had to our community, and we've tried to demonstrate the really serious consequences of locating it near a school and in a residential neighbourhood. So this is a bit of a kick in the teeth, but what I can absolutely guarantee is that the community campaign is as strong as it ever was, and in fact is only likely to get stronger going forward. So if the government thought this was going to silence us in any way, they're sadly mistaken.
When you talk about the impact on the community, can you describe to us what day-to-day life is like in your area and how it's changed since the injecting room was established?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, you know, when you draw hundreds and hundreds of drug dealers and users into a residential neighbourhood, it means that every time a resident, often with their family, with their children, or maybe with an elderly family member, just trying to go about their normal day-by-day life, just trying to go to the health centre that's right beside it, just trying to go to the school, just going down Victoria Street. If you talk to the traders, the same thing. They talk about the significant increase in drug dealing and just basically a rampant drug culture that the government's embedded in Richmond. So every day you don't know what you're going to encounter, but generally it's not very pleasant. And for such a wonderful community that North Richmond and Richmond more broadly is, it's a terrible, terrible thing to inflict on this community and expect them to put up with 3 more years of the same. It's just not good enough.
David Horseman, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
7-8.
Now, this injecting facility has been a point of quite some contention for local residents like Lola and like plenty of others for the entire 2 years it's been open and for, in fact, the lead-up time to when it was open. Now, just last month, the state's health department research found 63 out of 65 people feel unsafe near the clinic. But as we've heard, as we've discussed, the trial's being extended for another 3 years now. And there'll be around $9 million spent on improving amenity for locals, because community amenity is the one thing that hasn't improved all through this trial, according to the independent panel. I'd love to know what the locals think. On the line is David Horseman, spokesperson for the Medically Supervised Injecting Room Residents Action Group. That's quite a mouthful, David.
Yeah, it sure is.
Any surprise for you that it was extended for 3 more years?
Unfortunately, it's not a surprise. We were always hopeful that working collaboratively with the government and demonstrating all of the evidence that we have for 2 years, that common sense would prevail and that the injecting room trial would continue, but it would be moved to a hospital precinct. That was our goal. That's always been what we've advocated for. And unfortunately today that wasn't delivered.
Were you invited to give any feedback to the independent panel that's been conducting this review?
Yes, certainly there was the opportunity to meet with the panel, and we have also provided all of the evidence along the way. You know, it's a very large community campaign that have quite a number of us working on it on a day-by-day basis. And, you know, one of the things we've been really effective at is demonstrating the type of evidence that I think, or I suspect, Lola was referring to a moment ago. Even, you know, when you talked about the ambulance call-outs, for instance, I noticed a very clear equivocation today from the Minister that spoke about ambulance call-outs being down only while the injecting room was open. So I want to be clear that the actual evidence from Turning Point demonstrates that ambulance call-outs have actually gone up in the area.
But when the facility's closed is what the Minister's saying?
So what you're seeing there is absolutely that, a serious escalation, which is what we've been demonstrating. You know, there's a serious escalation in the numbers.
Does that tend to go to the argument then that it should be open 24/7?
Well, I think the problem with that is then the numbers, you're still getting that same level. You know, our issue has always been not against harm minimisation. Our position has always been we support any sort of sensible prevention, rehabilitation and harm minimisation holistic model. But what you can't do, and what all the experts said you shouldn't do, is put it in the heart of a residential neighbourhood, is put it beside children. It's just warped sensibility to do that. So the argument would be you need to provide a model that works to get people off the drugs, off their addiction, and keep them safe in the meantime. But the location is just fundamentally flawed, and you know, nothing today has addressed that fundamental underlying issue. But, you know, I just want to be really clear that that was an example of how the so-called statistics can be distorted. So it's not that ambulance call-outs went down. The actual data says otherwise, but it's being spun to represent a different picture that perhaps, you know, the average layperson just listening to it on the end of the radio wouldn't necessarily understand.
You are going to be stuck with it for another 3 years at the very least. I would assume it'll be extended after that.
So I suppose our position, this is also something that's very misleading from the government, and it's a really good opportunity to clear that up. So as everyone knows, legislation gets amended all the time. And this was our position through the first 2 years of the trial. All it takes for the location to change is an amendment to the legislation. And every time Parliament sits, there are parts of legislation that are amended. So while the trial may continue, I just want to be really clear to everyone listening out there, and certainly to our community members that would see this as a real kick in the guts today, the campaign really hasn't shifted now. It just means that we need to go for longer, and we need to ramp it up even further. We've tried to work collaboratively. We've tried to, you know, work hand in glove with the government, and they've very deliberately frozen the community out. The legislation on the location part of the legislation could change any time. Next week, next month, in 6 months' time.
Do you think a second site will help reduce perhaps some of the people you're seeing in and around the area? Will it help address any of your concerns, having a second site built way down the other end of Victoria Street, but down near Queen Victoria Markets?
I think it was always acknowledged that if you were going to take this policy line, if you are going to have injecting facilities, to have just one was a very, very big mistake. And in fact, you know, what was acknowledged today, which is interesting given that we've been saying it for 2 years and they tried to shut down the community voice, is that there has been a serious escalation. The huge numbers coming into the area. There was the proverbial honeypot. Now, the thing is, that continues to support the drug trade, though, because you have passive policing around these facilities in order for them to operate. The worst case scenario, that this would actually just further grow that drug market.
Okay.
So we understand the logic that, you know, you're somehow or other spreading the load, but I think that's yet to be demonstrated. What we've seen is actually the drug market just being supported to grow its trade, and I don't think that's what anyone wants. We want people to be prevented from being caught up in that. We want to save people's lives genuinely over the longer term.
David, final question to you. $9 million in community amenity uplift being offered to you. Any ideas what that could be spent on? Do you want it?
Well, absolutely. It would be crazy for us to say that we don't want investment in our community. And again, I think it's been acknowledged both in the public housing estate and in the broader surrounding area that investment has been sorely lacking for some time now. So, of course, we would always, like any community, welcome investment.
Happily take the $9 million on board. All right, thank you very much for your time this evening. David Horseman there, spokesperson for the Medically Supervised Injecting Room Residents Action Group. They'll have to add in a branch for the City of Melbourne, for North Melbourne now, I would think, for that Residents Action Group. 96900 693 13 13 32, your calls in a moment.